Hello everybody and welcome back to Brewmasters, where we interview tabletop game designers to get their insights on the craft. Today we're speaking to the legendary DMs Guild homebrewer Benjamin Huffman, the author behind many well-known brews such as the Pugilist, Magus and Spiritualist classes, as well as the Beastfolk, Dhampir, Packborn and Saurian races, founder of the Sterling Vermin Adventure Company, and of course the author of the Arcanist Handbook. Before we get to that though, this is your regular reminder to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the channel. It's valuable feedback for me to know that you enjoy what I'm doing, and if you don't want to miss on the next episode, use Thaumaturgy to click on that bell icon. Just to let you know, in the latter half of this episode we do discuss politics in the context of D&D and Wizards of the Coast from a leftist point of view. If you're tired of hearing about politics or just aren't in the headspace for it, consider this fair warning to dip out just after the Homebrew Challenge. With that out of the way, let's get to it. Benjamin, it's great to have you on the show. Thank you for making the time for us.
I'm happy to be here.
Fantastic. I'm curious, what got you into homebrewing in the first place?
Well, I started a very, very, very long time ago, in the mid-90s, when I was probably 10 or 12. I had just gotten a box set from AD&D called First Quest, and then I played that until I had basically the whole thing memorized. Then branched off into AD&D generally, and one of the things that I immediately loved about Dungeons and Dragons was that it wasn't a game you were just meant to play, you were also meant to make it as you engaged with it. And so I started making classes, new monsters, new rules, when I was just a kid. And every once in a while, across the span of my life, I've taken a break and stepped away from games, but keep coming back, and came back recently to D&D about 4 years ago now, maybe 5, and jumped right back in head first. And Pugilist class was one of the first thing I wrote for 5e, and it just absolutely blew up, which kind of got me hooked on writing for D&D.
Wow, yeah. So, I mean, as your first 5e homebrew, that I can't even
Yeah.
It's probably one of the most famous homebrews in 5th edition.
Yeah, it's really funny to have that be the first thing you write, because it was such a lightning in a bottle moment. I'm not even sure I totally understand what happened with the class. I think there was I think I released it around the time DMs Guild started, I think, which maybe was part of its success. It was a narrative archetype that I don't think D&D has ever fulfilled all that well too. So there's that piece too. But yeah, it's funny to have that be the first thing you ever write, because then it kind of feels like you're forever chasing that first victory again, because I've written plenty of very successful things, and I happen to know from my other DMs Guild author friends that I'm doing really well for myself. But when my mark is my first mark I can hold myself to is the Pugilist class, hard to live up to that.
Yeah, it sets the stage and makes it difficult to follow up.
Right. I wish it was like the thing I'm writing right now, but
We were talking a little bit about our home games before we got started. I pretty much all my players refuse to play above level 11 because they think that combat takes too long and it gets too complicated.
Yeah, we actually have just been talking today on Twitter about wishing there was a version of D&D that just went up to 10th level for some of those same reasons.
Yeah, they probably could rescale the game to just work across, even just take those 10 levels and spread them out to 20.
Yeah, I mean, and then there's a lot you'd take out of the game too, like just all the hit point bloat and all the damage scaling that the hit point bloat requires. And a lot of the utility spells, rather than make them cost 6th or 7th or 8th, 9th level spell slots, just turn them into rituals that are really expensive to cast or whatever, and make it take a day or 2 days to cast, so that, I don't know, I think there's just some fun stuff to explore there. But there's so many levels that don't get played or almost never get played in Dungeons and Dragons that it's kind of weird to have that design space that almost no one interacts with.
Yeah, true. I feel like it almost holds on a bit too tightly to some parts of 3.5.
Right. Yeah. Hmm.
I don't know if that's just because like the player base was very heavily involved in making 5th edition what it was.
Yeah, it could be. I mean, I think also 5e was so much about trying to tie together a bunch of different historical parts of D&D into a single cohesive thing that um that's what they took. That's just one of the things they took from 3e was that.
Yeah, it very much felt like a kind of a legacy edition of the game, like kind of a last
Uh,
hurrah.
yeah, absolutely. It's definitely an edition that's kind of a retrospective on what Dungeons and Dragons has been over the course of its existence, with like a splash of modernizing, but very little modernizing, mostly just um, modernizing it by way of simplifying the game and making it accessible.
Yeah, it's almost like a greatest hits is like what I think I would say.
Uh-huh. That's a really good way to think of it. Yeah, like the greatest hits of D&D.
Although no save or die.
Yes, hugely relieving. No save or die. There's a few save 3 times or die effects, or save twice and or die effects, but no, just save or die effects.
Are you particularly anti save or die?
Oof, I hate it. Um, I mean, there's a lot in D&D about like death and dying that I don't like. I don't like save or die effects because I play D&D to have a story, and when some character is just kind of unceremoniously killed, uh, it sort of drains all the tension out of the story because then you're left with one of two things: drop all the plot threads that character had, or two, resurrect them, which cheapens the death as even a part of the game. Um, so yeah, I mean, I think saver die effects kind of exemplify to me one of the cornerstone problems of D&D uh, in that respect.
Yeah, I mean, I've definitely heard arguments for and against. I mean, it's interesting to hear your take on it.
Yeah, so I mean that's the core of my problem with the saver die effects is that it doesn't feel good as a player to just lose one roll and have your character die. It doesn't feel good as the DM to invest plot threads in a character to have them make one misroll and then they're out of the game. Um, and then the alternative is that you provide some way for the character to get back that's relatively easy, um, and just to not disrupt the story too much. And then that kind of makes death like a thing that with no weight in the game. And so I really don't like either of those options. I don't like the option where that character is out of the game and you just drop all the plot threads you were building for them. And I don't like the option where death is not significant at all.
Yeah, really what you want is, in that case, I think, is like for it to have a heavy like narrative impact without it being disruptive to the narrative.
Right. I mean, to some extent, this is just the problem with a game that tries to do simulation versus a narrative kind of approach to tabletop role playing. Um, a game that's about simulation is going to have like death occur kind of somewhat randomly or setbacks occur kind of somewhat randomly, whereas in a narrative system, it would be kind of a series of consequences that might lead you to death, but it's never going to feel random. It's always going to feel like the story built to that point.
Yeah, yeah. Like in that context, it feels like 5th edition, by trying to play to everyone, loses some of its identity.
Yeah, although this has always been an issue with D&D, it's not like a new thing. It's just the problem with the simulation as being the kind of core crux of your um, game. In other games where the mechanics are written to not model some kind of alternative version of real life, but are written to model stories about the genre that the game is about. Then you've got um, rules where death only comes in a kind of thematically and genre appropriate moment.
Yeah, because it really does have like that feel of when you're trying to please everyone, you don't really please anyone.
Yeah, yeah. One thing I'm surprised by is that 5e actually doesn't suffer from that too much, because it does do a lot of. I kind of feel like 5e almost proves that sometimes you do everything for everyone, and they don't love it, but they like it enough that you keep that big tent together. Like, I really loved fourth edition, which was a much maligned edition for D&D.
Hmm.
But to me, it's like, well, yeah, if D&D is basically a miniatures game, which it always has been, why not make it a really clean, uh, well executed, well designed miniatures game? And that's what fourth edition was, and it was awesome. It was so fun to play. In fifth edition, I just want combat to be over as quickly as I can. Like, it's so boring. I just want it to be over as soon as it starts. Whereas in fourth edition, there were lots of really interesting moments of like decision making, that fifth edition just doesn't have. But it's got other things that make it worth playing. Like, it's so dead simple is kind of is a huge selling point.
Yeah, it definitely feels like fourth edition, from what I've heard, had a very, very strong sense of its own identity and played really well
Mhm.
to that at the expense of splitting the fan base.
Right. Well, it's kind of like if fifth edition is the greatest hits version of D&D, then fourth edition was that weird album that they made that didn't match the genre they had built their fan base in.
Yeah.
It was experimental, and it was had a really strong identity, and the identity did not match up to what people expected from D&D. Um, I've always thought D&D was a miniatures war game with kind of wearing a mask of a role-playing game. And
Mm.
I liked that in fourth edition they didn't bother to try to put that mask on. Um, they just let it be what it was and said, you're still going to do all the role-playing stuff you would do in any D&D, but we're not going to pretend like this game is built for or balanced around that, or made to do many interesting things there.
Yeah.
And because if you look at fifth edition, like 90% of the rules, 95% of the rules are about combat. So it's definitely a game about combat, a game about fighting. Um, it just tries. There's a little more effort to make it seem like it's a game about a lot more than that. Um, Even though parts of the game that you interact with are largely about combat, just not very exciting or interesting combat.
Yeah, and this is something that I've talked about like quite a lot recently, mostly because I was having like a crisis myself with DMing fifth edition,
Hmm.
in that I've always had trouble really making combat like punchy and interesting.
Hmm.
Like,
Yeah.
I want my players to care about what each other are going to do on their turn, but most of the time, like, I think, I think it was the Angry DM I spoke to very recently. And he pointed out that in 5th edition combat, you largely have two options on your turn as a player. Where are you going to stand and how are you going to try and deal damage? Like, you might occasionally do some other stuff, but that's the majority of it.
Hmm.
And making those options interesting or relevant to other people is like, you have to put effort in as a DM to make that
Yeah.
worthwhile. Like,
Yeah.
either by making the environment interesting in a sense that you then force the player to have to consider where to stand, or you use the enemies in an interesting way that their position matters. And for dealing damage, you can't really innovate on that without bringing back some problems from like 3.5, where you had like lots of damage types interacting with each other in interesting ways. Like the
Hmm.
idea of using healing or positive energy on a undead creature to damage it, or using negative energy on an undead creature to heal it, and things like that.
Hmm.
But then you get into the problem that, oh, well, that's only going to work once and your players aren't going to care about it after that. Like, it's a one hit
Right.
interest thing.
Yeah. Um, so I've actually found that the only cure for that problem in fifth edition is if the players are willing to experiment. And I don't know if I have a sense yet of how to cultivate that style of play as a DM with my players, but I have played with groups of players who would just try random things that weren't fighting on their turn. They'd be like, okay, well, I'm going to throw the ball bearings all over the ground and just try to push the person. And so the players themselves are changing the environment and trying to create an advantage for themselves using the environment. And that when they do that, I try to super reward it, because that's what it would make fifth edition like the fifth edition combat interesting, as if players were constantly trying to do things that aren't on their character sheet, basically, and really aren't even in the rule book.
Yeah.
Because you're right. Otherwise, I mean, I played a fighter, I think, for the first big campaign I played of fifth edition, and so boring, so boring.
That's like one of the most tactically interesting classes. Like,
yeah, but I mean, it's just like like you said, it's where do you stand and what are you going to do to deal damage? But with a fighter, it's like basically, well, I'm going to use my weapon to deal damage. So there's not really even a question beyond that. I mean, if you go by what the game seems to be telling you you're supposed to be doing each turn, it's just basically standing in one place and swinging repeatedly until the thing dies, and then moving to another place and swinging repeatedly until that thing dies.
yeah, it's an unfortunate thing to like really realize in a way, because it kind of like, I don't know if for other people it might solidify that oh yeah, that is boring, isn't it? Like, like they might not have realized it, but now that I've pointed it out, it might be terrible.
Yeah, I mean, there are cures for that. I mean, like the Battle Master is a great cure for that, although I didn't happen to be playing a Battle Master in that game. But yeah, it's just a systemic problem for the game.
Yeah,
but I don't think it helps that you've got as you level up, HP pools inflate, and then combat starts taking longer, and then that becomes even more obvious. Like as fights start to last more than 2 rounds, it's like, oh yeah, this really is just, I just do the same thing every single time.
yeah, like you're very much encouraged to just use your most optimal option every turn, and then when you level up, you might get a new most optimal option.
Except in some classes cases, there is only ever one optimal choice each turn of combat for the entire length of leveling up. Like a rogue should only ever be trying to sneak attack, and probably be dual wielding so that it can get 2 opportunities to do that on its turn. There's one way really to play a rogue, and then there's a lot of ways to play it so that it's like less good, but not competitively different, just less good.
Yeah, there's a game design term, I think, core loops. Like the rogue combat core loop is going to be attack, disengage, hide.
Yeah, right.
Well, disengage, move, hide. But yeah, that's like what you're going to be doing every combat for 20 levels potentially.
Right.
Which is what, like 3 years of play?
Yeah. And I mean, and the fighter is not a whole lot better, because all it gets is multi-attack, so it's, to some extent, it's even more boring. The only difference is that the fighter does get things like a couple bonus action stuff it can trigger, and it makes a decision about when it's going to trigger those bonus action things. But then you've also got things like I can't remember if it's Action Surge. Like Action Surge is a cool ability, but unless you really anticipate something weird happening later in a fight, it's always best to dump everything you can as early as you can in the fight to finish it up before you take damages that would cost more resources.
Yeah, 100%. And the game definitely seems to encourage it. When I was speaking to Angry, we were talking about like there were these 2 particular combat scenarios that were really like memorable to my players. Like they have been for years, and they were both situations in which the players were put into a situation where they were broken out of that same 2 option turn, and a third option appeared. with there was an entomber when we were playing 3.5. And I don't know if you know the gimmick of that monster. It buries you when it attacks you.
Okay.
You're constantly balancing between unburying your friends and fighting the monster. And Angry pointed out that in that situation, you then have a third decision to make, which is a choice, not a decision. Like the decision would be like optimal and mathematical and really boring and straightforward, and you do it all the time. Whereas the choice was a character decision, which is like, what kind of person am I? Am I going to sacrifice one of my friends to fight the monster? Am I going to try and save my friend and put everyone else in danger? Like, it added that extra twist element, which I don't think was necessarily even intentional, but became entirely baked into that creature just through that adding that one interesting mechanic.
I mean, all of my best combats have included something like that. I don't think very often as a result of the monster stat block, but like I'm thinking of combats that I've run on airships where the party is being boarded and somebody's got to be piloting the airship still, so they're not really engaged in the fight, but they're doing their own separate kind of skill challenge thing while the fight's happening. And then the other players are either trying to help the ship stay up or do the fight, kind of depending as the action unfolds. And those kinds of scenarios are really fun and cool. But yeah, I mean, you do have to be either throwing a monster that's got some weird abilities like the entomber, or creating kind of a novel setting for that fight to take place to really break out of that monotonous loop that many classes fall into in the game.
Yeah, and I think that is something that you see emerging a lot in homebrew. I don't know if people necessarily realize that that is like at its core what they're trying to solve, is that problem of having two actions on each turn. But you see it in like Angry DM's I can't remember the name of his particular monsters, but he's got like the ones which are like two monsters in one, and when you defeat one it changes its moveset to the other. I think the mythic monsters in that new D&D setting they released a little recently.
Okay, the Theros.
Yeah, they do a very similar thing.
That sounds familiar. I'm not familiar with it, but that it does sound like something I was reading about on Twitter or seeing. Yeah, I mean that's one way of doing it, and I am, as a lover of JRPGs, I'm always a fan of monsters that have phases, or especially boss monsters that have phases.
And Matthew Colville as well had the action-orientated monsters, which make the monsters more interesting. But I don't know if that solves the problem of making combat more interesting.
It can. I mean, actually, now that I'm thinking about it, the Pugilist kind of has that boss monster mechanic of changing partway through the match, just by virtue of the I think it's Bloodied but Unbowed is the first version of that.
True.
Yeah. So not to toot my own horn, but just to think about how, that was one of the design things I was thinking about when I was working on that class, was how to make the gameplay loop interesting. And it wasn't then to change the turn by turn thing. It was to say, well, then there's stages to each fight. And sometimes you're at this stage of the fight and sometimes you're at this. And you can kind of decide when you're going to kick it to that second stage.
Yeah, I definitely feel like for 5th edition to like really heel turn at this point, they need to introduce more content that has that baked in, like that element of providing like a gimmick or an environmental effect or like third option to potentially like a new set of monsters or a new type. Maybe not for all of them, like you need different monsters for different situations, but it feels like it's been oversimplified in that sense.
Well, I mean, the other option is just to focus less on fighting, to make fighting a part of the game, but not so much a part of the game. Like I would be perfectly fine if they never touched fighting again, but added in campaign actions or really a robust downtime action system where my fighter can own a tavern when he's not adventuring, and there's sort of a mini game to what managing a tavern is. Like I can hire people or fire people or manage the money. I mean, obviously it would need to be something you could resolve in like 5 to 10 minutes at the end of a session. I think there's a, we're talking about specifically the problem in fighting in D&D, but I think it's okay to not solve the problem as long as you're also not basically saying, by virtue of focus of the rules, that fighting is the most important thing that you do in D&D.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, it was probably Matt Colville who said it, but if you look at the player's handbook, like a solid 50% of it is based on fighting monsters, right? Like that's the central crux of the game. Like it's central mechanics.
Yeah, it's the mechanical focus. I mean, and
that's a better word of putting it.
yeah, I mean, what it makes me think of is like, partly because I was writing a cleric archetype earlier and looking at spell lists. One thing that irks me so much about the spell list in D&D is how many spells there are for killing things in a fight or not dying in a fight. When like if you lived in a world where magic was real and all of these things could be happening, like there would just be magic would be so much about utility. I mean, there would definitely be spells for killing people and spells for going to war and healing and all that stuff, of course. But there'd also be spells to like build a hut without having to expend a ton of resources or
True
labor, all that kind of stuff. And I think maybe we can surmise that some worlds of D&D have spells like that. But when the book shows you that the majority of spells are about fighting, that's just kind of another way in which it's telling you this is a game about fighting. You should be fighting. If there's action, that action is a combat between two or more sides.
Yeah, I don't know if D&D is defined by its combat system.
What do you mean by that?
Like, I would say that probably through the earlier editions to 3.5 at least, if you played D&D, it was probably most iconically known for its robust combat system. And I feel like as we've gone through the different editions, obviously like the landscape of players has changed and what they're interested in, like the kind of stuff they've been exposed to. Obviously other RPGs have risen and fallen around it. And I mean, I've heard of D&D being almost like a laughingstock in like the 90s, until they kind of pulled it back with 3.5. Because like so many people jumped into like the White Wolf series and it was like all edgy back then. So,
there was a lot of 90s edge, yeah.
But I wonder if like they have misread potentially what 5th edition could have been, like, because if it's so iconically known by its historical fan base for its combat, and roleplay has largely been something that other people have brought in from other games. I mean, I don't know if that's necessarily a founded like idea, but it definitely feels like in this edition that role-playing has become more central to games, even though it's not necessarily something that's outlined in the player's handbook. Like, popularized certainly by things like Critical Role and that kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's no way the team that created 5e could have known how well it was going to be received and how wide the audience was going to be. I think they certainly, I'm not sure exactly when Critical Role started. I know it started, I think, as a Pathfinder game, right?
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, so I believe it started as a Pathfinder game, and so they had some inkling that there was like, there was an audience for a role play centric game. They also had evidence that they didn't have to write a role play centric game to have that happen, because Critical Role existed, and Pathfinder is like not. I mean, Pathfinder has a much worse combat focus than D&D does. So they had evidence that they didn't need to write mechanics or support for role playing for that to be a thing people do around the table. So I imagine that is a big part of why they didn't bother to focus all that much on it. But I do think at some point, with the 6th edition or maybe with expansions to 5e, someone's going to have to drag Dungeons and Dragons kicking and screaming into modernity in terms of ideas about game design and what how mechanics should relate to the theme and the fiction of a game.
Yeah, I definitely feel like, I mean, I've probably chewed this point a few times over the different conversations I've had on this show, but I feel like we're at the point where we would have normally moved to 6th edition by now. And obviously, Wizards have no intention of that. And I think that if they're going to keep adding to 5th edition, it's just perpetuating the existing problems without really fixing anything. Because as we've said, like, it's everything for everyone without really catering to anyone individually. And I feel like it's really just kind of not really satisfying anyone at the end of the day. I mean, obviously people have a great time with the game and everything, but I think if you play it long enough, you see those holes start to appear, and that's when you start to get into homebrewing more. Because, I mean, I certainly wanted to try and patch up the holes that I was finding, and I've ultimately discovered that you just would have to rebuild the game like to be able to make it fit the vision that I wanted. And I'm probably projecting to some extent, but I wonder how many other people out there feel the same way or will come to that same conclusion eventually.
Yeah. I mean,
It's a bit of a doomer take.
Yeah, I mean, I think to me, in an ideal world, what the Dungeon Master's Guide would do is, and it does this to some extent, but I don't think it does it very well, is help you figure out how to tweak the game to do what you want it to do. There's some like examples of like a 7th ability score you could add in there. Both of them are really problematic that I remember being in the book. And I don't think there's good guidance anyway on like the number of spells you'd have to write to make a new saving throw matter, or what you could do instead of making saving. There's lots of additional things you need to think about if you're going to add a 7th ability score in beyond just here's a 7th ability score. But I mean, to me, what I've always loved about D&D is hacking it and changing it and making it a different thing. So I actually would love to see that kind of culture of homebrew more embraced by the community than it is. I often, in the early days of writing, before I think people started to see me as more of a professional, people would often dog on or trash the things I was writing as just homebrew. And it would be accurate to call it homebrew, but it's also weird to use that as a pejorative. Like, homebrew is a really good thing. It's what makes your game different than the millions of other people playing D&D.
Yeah.
I don't need to be playing the exact same thing all of those other people are. It's cool that I can go from table to table and the specifics of the game kind of change and shift. It's nice that there's a game that when I play it, I kind of broadly know what to expect. But it's also nice that when I go in, there'll be the individual changes of that table. I think that's honestly D&D's greatest strength, and I think that they do well to offer more support to the average person who this might be their first game design experience, is trying to hack D&D. I mean, it was my first game design experience.
Mine too. And I think, like, yeah, you're absolutely right. Like, D&D encourages you from the very start to be a brewer. Like, it tells you to make your own world and like try and think of your own gods and decide like on new races and stuff. Like, it's got like sections in the DMG as poorly written as they might be, to encourage you to make your own content.
Mhm.
And yeah, it doesn't make sense for it to be like a dirty word in any sense.
I played a game of Rolemaster in the 90s, and Rolemaster is a super complicated TTRPG. It's fun in its own way, but it's way too needlessly complicated. But
Mm.
the game I played though, the DM for it had 2 binders full of homebrew rules for the game, and I literally thought, I mean, I was somewhere between 12 and 16 at that time. I thought that was the coolest thing in the world. I like idolized that guy because he had the game and that wasn't enough, and he built basically a whole second game on top of it, just adding new player options, adding new things to explore in the world, not even just magic items, but like whole kinds of magic items, and I don't know, just like lots of really cool, amazing stuff. And that was like a really formative experience for me too, but also really formative in terms of my relationship with game design and feeling like game design is for everyone. Um, it's not. I think it's so weird when um, there's like gatekeeping around who can be called a game designer or what we call game design and what we don't. It's like if you're changing a game, it's game design and you're a game designer.
Absolutely.
And that's fun. It's so fun. And I wish there was no kind of negative connotation to the word homebrew because everyone should be doing it. It's such a blast.
And yeah, I mean, I've definitely reached the point now where I think last week I announced, well, on the last episode, I've reached a point where I think I need to accept that fifth edition doesn't cater to the needs that I have as like a DM and as a player.
Mhm.
And certainly like trying to brew my way out of that situation has been chaotic.
Mhm.
Because I mean, you could go to the lengths of like customizing the entire rule system, but at that point, you're just making your own game. So
Right.
I think everyone who sticks with brew long enough does reach a point where they begin working on their own games, and then that's where you get entirely new RPGs from, like, and that's fantastic.
Yeah. Yeah. And you get the skills to write a whole new game and a whole new like types of games
Mm.
by practicing and by writing those like homebrews and those changes. Um, and I just think there's a lot of value um, creatively, intellectually to homebrewing, to game designing that it can lead to financial success in some way, maybe kind of a little bit. But the best part is getting to play the game you want to play, as you were kind of getting at. The best part is
Mm.
that at the end of it, you get to play the game you want to play.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't complain if I end up making something that made money. Like, I don't think anyone does.
Yeah.
But I think if that's the only reason you're doing it, then it's your brew is probably going to suffer for it.
Yeah. I mean, I think if you write long enough, you can eventually get to the point to where you can write pretty good stuff even when you're not super passionate about it. Um, but you have to write about things you're passionate about for a long time, I think, before you get to that place where you start building the skills of writing good stuff that you're just kind of like okay with, but not super jazzed about.
Yeah. And it's like anything that you do professionally, right? Like you end up having to, if you're a games tester, you end up playing games that you hate because you have to. If you're like a movie critic, you're going to have to go and see films you don't like. Like,
Right. Right. Exactly. Um, I mean, I do contract work on top of the writing I do for myself or under my own name, and sometimes I like or enjoy what I'm writing. Sometimes I don't super like or enjoy what I'm writing. But I would say it actually has helped me grow as a writer and a designer to write for things that I'm less excited about or that weren't my idea in the first place. Just because usually my process when I'm writing and designing for my own thing is it happens in bits and bursts where like when I'm excited about it, I write a ton, and then I kind of like lose motivation or I think about other things and I don't write on it for a long time. Practice of writing something that you're not that excited about is that I'm going to consistently sit down, look at this, and iterate on it. Even if I only write one new thing a day, two new lines, it's progress. Um,
Hmm.
and ultimately, some stuff that I sat down and didn't think I was going to like writing, by the time I was done, I was like, this is better than like 95% of the stuff I've written. And it was, I don't know. I mean, I don't know what to say about that, except that it's just it's been a fun ride, and always am excited about other people who are either just starting to or who have been doing it for a little while and are moving into a new phase of their relationship with games and game design.
Absolutely. And I think that's actually a really good point because, like, I'm definitely going through a transitory period, like, in my journey through D&D. Like, I've been playing hardcore D&D for, like, 14 years, 15 years almost.
Hmm.
And it's taken this long for me to feel like I'm finally at a point where I'm going to be venturing into uncharted waters. And I feel like everyone who is involved with D&D and finds that kind of love for it has to go through their own journey, and it's really interesting to see what comes out of that.
Yeah, I mean, the other cool thing is that there's stuff I would never, even in a million years, think to write. That then you see it on like DM's Guild, for instance, and it's just like, holy crap, that's an awesome idea. That is so cool, and it never would have occurred to me to have thought of that. So I mean, that's also why I get excited about more people getting into game design, and somebody's got the proliferation of like DM's Guild, Drive Through RPG, that kind of stuff. Like, I want as many people in game design as possible because other people have awesome ideas I could never possibly have thought about that does improve my games just by it existing out there and me knowing about it and getting to explore it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm a massive hoarder of homebrew, which is kind of how I got into all this.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I mean, just being able to see like the sheer amount of content there is out there and like the diversity of it. Like, if I run into the Saurians race, like I would never have thought to have like a dinosaur race in D&D, like, and it
Mm-hmm.
just fits so well. Like, it makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a big fan of. I actually don't even know his real name, but Walrock Homebrew. Um, like every time he releases something, I'm like, good God, this is awesome, and I'm just like so excited every time he puts something out. Um, I think it just really goes to show how you don't need all the infrastructure like that Wizards of the Coast would have to produce really amazing quality um, D&D material or content or expansions.
Hmm. I have to say, I'm not familiar with that brewer. Is there any particular brews you can signal boost, like to give us an idea?
I don't know the names. He writes a lot of races, and I'm always like super. I always find the races he writes to be super interesting. Um, which I could shout something in particular out right now. He's got um, a moth folk race on DM's Guild that in particular when he released that I was just like, yeah, that's really super neat and I want to play that. He also does classes and class options though. He wrote a witch class and I think I have that, but I'm also kind of a collector of witch homebrew, so I'm not sure if I can separate it in my mind from all the other witch homebrews I've read. But yeah, he also just, in addition to being a very good writer, he's also he does really good uh, layout work, like like the stuff you want to read the things that he writes, just because the covers of what he writes are so well done. So that's that randomly leads me to thinking that another really fun thing about game design is all the other skills that you end up picking up in pursuit of executing game design well.
True. Like, if you've ever had to sit in InDesign for hours upon hours, like, you pick up a lot.
Yeah. Thankfully, I've never had to, because from my very early days of homebrewing, I met Nathaniel on. Actually, you know what? He told me how to pronounce his name once, and it was definitely not Nathaniel. I'm gonna call him Nate, because I think he goes by Nate too, and I won't mess up Nate.
Sure.
So I met Nate really early on in my when I was homebrewing primarily on Reddit, and he has done like all my layout ever since then. And he does it super well, and he does it super fast. So I have never had to do any layout stuff myself. So I kind of envy people who have picked up those skills over the course of doing whatever they're doing. But also, it's really nice to never have to worry about that.
No, I totally appreciate that. So this might actually be a good time for us to quickly dip over into the Homebrew Challenge.
Okay.
I don't know if I mentioned this to you already.
I don't think you have, no.
So there's like a little bit we like to do.
Okay.
Basically, I get the illustrious guests to come up with an idea for a homebrew just on the spot. And we get a little bit of insight into your process. If you're okay with that.
All right. Yeah, we can do that.
Okay, so I'm going to give the D20 a roll, and we'll see what kind of brew we end up with. So that is a weapon homebrew. It doesn't have to be fully statted, just enough of an idea to build off of.
Okay. So we're kind of just wanting to do my design process out loud. I'll just kind of do my design process out loud.
Yeah, that'd be fantastic, if you don't mind.
Okay. Yeah, sure. So when I'm thinking about writing weapons, which I don't often do, but when I'm thinking about writing weapons, the place I start is by figuring out what's not in the system that I want to be there. So sometimes that might be kind of specific cultural weapons that I don't think are well represented by just reskinning the weapons in the player's handbook. And other times it's by looking at particular pieces of fantasy and figuring out how to write that weapon into D&D. Like I've written lightsabers into D&D in its own way, and I've written size and stuff like that into D&D in its own way. So that's always where I start. And then I figure out, and then I start looking at weapon properties and figuring out, do the weapon properties cover the fantasy of the weapon? If I can be redundant, because it's been so long since I've written it that I don't super remember it, I'd like to use the psi as an example, because I think the psi does something. It is used in fighting in a really interesting way that D&D doesn't handle very well. So the first thing I would do if I'm trying to write a psi, is trying to put a psi weapon into D&D, is I would look at the list of weapon properties and start figuring out which weapon properties would make sense for this weapon, and do they fully cover the fiction of the weapon. So what I know of psi weapons is that they're primarily a defensive tool used for disarming armed opponents. And when you look at weapon properties, we would really quickly see, oh no, there's nothing even remotely like that in weapon properties already. So we know by looking at the weapon properties list, we're going to have to come up with a whole new weapon property to handle this. Then you have to start crafting your weapon property that's going to cover the fiction of. So it's a defensive weapon that, sort of the goal is that you catch enemy attacks with it, and maybe you twist it to disarm them. So that's the fictional concept I'm trying to put into mechanics. then you start thinking about how much of that can I really put in and have it still be balanced. And once you start thinking about that, I think it would be pretty. You'd come to the conclusion pretty quickly that like, well, I can't just have a weapon that disarms enemies. That would be amazing. Like you would use that everywhere, especially if you knew your opponent had a magical weapon, and just be like, I'm gonna take that. So instead, maybe you focus then on that defensive element of the weapon. So okay, so we have rules for shields in D&D, so maybe we can think about how um, some kind of weapon that blends the properties of a shield and a weapon. Um,
Hmm.
so when we start thinking about that, then we think, well, size are blunt instruments. They're not. It's not. I mean, sometimes in comics or whatnot, they come to points, but I've never in real life seen one that ends in a point. It's always really a dull edge or a dull uh, point to the prongs. So it's a bludgeoning weapon. So it should do bludgeoning damage. It's a rather small weapon, which going by kind of the design thought process of D&D weapons means that it probably is a D4 or a D6 bludgeoning. And then we figure out what the weapon properties we're going to add in there. Size are often used as a pair, so it would make sense to put the light property in so that people can dual wield them. And then we've got to come up with our new weapon property that's going to help us play out the fantasy of that weapon, which is that it's used primarily defensively. And that's when you might come up with a property like I have in the past called defensive, where it gives you a +1 to your armor class as long as you're not using a shield. It doesn't stack with other pluses either, so it's just a +1 as long as you're wielding one weapon with a uh, defensive property, and you're not using a shield. You get a +1 to your armor class.
Hmm.
So just with that one feature, first of all, we've created a lot of new space in the game. Size one example of that, but I mean, you can imagine that that weapon property is pretty interesting. You could stick that on a lot of different things, and that would be cool. You might even come up with new versions of weapons that exist already using that weapon property.
Yeah, it's just like a
Um,
new precedent.
yeah, exactly. So I think that is or well, I was jumping into a retrospective already on that, but let me go back. Um, so yeah, so the size that we're creating right now, then I think a bonus to armor class is so good that I think we have to make sure that that damage die is low, and especially because we gave it light also, so we can expect people are going to be making offhand attacks using their bonus action while they're using these weapons. So with those thoughts in mind, we're gonna make the psi do a D4 bludgeoning damage instead of we were thinking about D4 D6 earlier, but between the strength of the defensive property and the fact that light is going to mean that you can attack twice with this weapon each turn, or at least twice with this weapon each turn, then we need to then D4 is a kind of a more reasonable damage for it to be doing to be competitive with other weapons.
Very cool.
Yeah. So um, I think it's much simpler when you're not coming up with a new weapon property, but also I think most weapons in that you want to come up with can be reskinned from the ones that are on the list until you start coming up with new weapon properties. And then you get a lot of kind of interesting new toys to play with.
Yeah, definitely. I think like weapons in earlier editions were certainly much more diverse than they are these days.
They were, and to some extent, I really appreciate 5e just being like, yeah, I'm not going to make you look through a list of 40 weapons and like puzzle out what the difference between these 5 different weapons are. I'm
Yeah.
just gonna say, and also like 3.E had a bunch of like seriously goofy, like racial weapons, like kind of Darth Maul lightsabers, but as hammers and swords and all this other stuff that was just like,
Yeah.
even as like a teenager, I looked at it and I was like, this is so dumb. I mean, like I don't it actively harms my ability to enjoy the game imagining these things happening. And actually, I don't think any of my friends ever played those using those kinds of weapons anyway. Thankfully, because it would
Mm.
be very hard to take seriously if somebody were walking in with a dual-sided hammer or a I'm not sure dual-sided is the right word, but two hammers basically fused together.
Yeah, it can get a little silly.
Yeah,
Or
yeah,
like the complex, like just needlessly complex stuff, like the masterwork weapons, where it's like it's a +1, but it's not magical. And if it does become magical, it just replaces the +1. It doesn't add to it.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, I like the idea of there being space for masterwork weapons and for there to be some difference between non-magical weapons that are really finely crafted. I think that's a cool thing to have represented.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, I mean, I think older versions of D&D didn't mind having really complex, specific rules for things that rarely came up. And 5e, if it's going to have specific rules that are challenging to parse, they're going to come up frequently. They're not going to write really finicky rules and then be like, yeah, but this will only come up like once every 10 sessions, maybe.
Yeah, it was very much the case that the older edition's solution to everything was crunch. Like we're gonna solve
Right.
this problem with numbers and new rules.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, we're not going to let people like kind of figure this out on their own, or we're not going to come up with a simple solution that might not completely cover the fiction but hints at it. No, we're going to come up with this really intricate rule that is kind of a pain to even remember it exists, let alone where it is in the book, or which of the books it's in.
Yeah. Ah, the good old days. But
Yeah, I mean, some people really love that design ethos. I mean, the ongoing success of Pathfinders to some extent is proof that some people like that design ethos, but it's definitely not something I enjoy.
yeah, I mean that's totally appreciable. And I think it's interesting the way that you do kind of end up with different games catering to all those
Mhm.
different aspects and different strengths. Like as you say, there's the Pathfinder solution. There's like ridiculously complex stuff like Shadowrun. Like
Mhm.
I'm pretty sure there's a rule in 5th edition Shadowrun where if you have an explosive device go off near a wall, you have to calculate the damage of the shockwave being bounced off of the wall as well as the base damage. So like you can have it if you blow up in a corner, it's ridiculous.
Yeah, that's really insane. And I wonder if it's I mean, I would not even have fun trying to figure that out.
No.
But but you know, obviously some people do somehow.
But then it pulls into that like idea that we've talked about on the show before, where modularity feels like it's going to be very much the future of D&D
Uh-huh. Yeah.
because it works so well in 5th edition at present, which is why I think Homebrew is taking off so much for 5th edition.
Yeah, I didn't pay much attention to D&D Next when they were doing that, but that was the early day or before 5th edition was released. They did a series of big playtest packets and they collected feedback on them, and that kind of process was called D&D Next.
Mm.
And when they were developing D&D 5th edition, one of the things that they said was a goal, I don't think it ended up being executed, but what that they said was a goal was the idea of kind of modular mechanical systems. So lots of systems that you could kind of plug into or unplug from the game without it being super complicated to do that. Um, what one example that did make it into the game is feats. It's very easy to play the game without
Mm.
feats. Nothing is written with the expectation that feats are going to be in the game. But it's this thing that plugs in to the game. That's also is super simple to plug in. Like once you plug it in, it doesn't make anything necessarily more complicated, apart from the fact that you've added it in.
Mm.
Um, in the same, I think I'd love to have seen that system modularity bit remain a goal of the game, because it would be really cool to have, like, I mean, and they could have made a whole book out of seventh ability scores and just said, like, if you want to plug any one of these into the game, here's how you would do it. Here's some spells to support it. Here's skills to support it. Whatever else they want to say. Um, And I think that's a worthy design goal, modularity, and kind of lets people make the game as complicated or as simple as they want it to be.
Yeah, and I think like for the kind of design ethos they went for, where I think like where so much of fifth edition kind of goes right and wrong at the same time is that their solution to a lot of the problems is the DM gets to just decide. Like,
Mm-hmm.
and it feels like I've said that it feels a lot like the fifth edition is incomplete in a way because
Mm-hmm.
there's so many of these holes in it where they've basically just kind of gone like your DM, you can decide, and
Mm-hmm.
you must have an extension of the DM which is just Mike Mills's Twitter. Like,
Mm-hmm.
and it feels like where they went wrong with that is that instead of making it like instead of answering and saying fifth edition like this hole here, that's the DM's problem, they should
Mm-hmm.
have made it a modular solution in a future book.
Yeah, I mean that's one way of doing it. I also think just giving DMs good guidance could solve a lot of that too.
Hmm.
At some point in the last year or two, I was asked what the best Dungeon Master's Guide was across the different editions, and I said the Dungeon World is the best Dungeon Master's Guide because everything that you really need to know to run a game that's not about game mechanics, but it's about actually making the game fun. Like I've never found good advice about that in a Dungeon Master's Guide. But Dungeon World, which is a powered by the Apocalypse system take on D&D, um, is full of like amazing DM advice and actually really succinct DM advice too. There's probably about 20 pages that's broken down. That's 10 rules, but then it's kind of expanded upon and over the course of I don't know. I'm guessing 20 pages. Um, and if D&D offered really good DM advice, it might be okay to say your DM will decide. But I don't think D&D does a great job of helping people figure out how to DM unless they've had a lot of experience of watching DMs run the game.
Yeah, I'd say that's fair because like so much of D&D is handed down, right?
Absolutely, yeah. I saw somebody actually. Um, I don't remember if there was like an article attached to it or what, but like the argument that D&D was an oral tradition. That even though we have books for it, it's a culturally it's an oral tradition, and that seems really correct to me. I mean,
Mm.
you don't read the book having never played or heard of D&D and then go out and play it. It's always passed on from one person to the other. And I mean, well, I don't want to say always. I actually learned it from a book, but today I don't know that I would have. It's very rarely learned from a book. It's often learned from seeing it on Twitch or meeting someone in person who plays it, and then they tell you about it, and you're like, "Oh, it's cool. Yeah, I'll try." Um, so in that sense, I think it's really accurate to say it's an oral tradition. That doesn't mean we can't also write good, salient advice about it.
Yeah, 100%. I think it was it might have been Angry or maybe Izzy that I was talking to, but someone was explaining how when fifth edition was coming about, they had the problem in fourth edition where DMs were moving on to like Pathfinder because they
Mm-hmm.
didn't like what they had in fourth edition, and
Mm-hmm.
apparently the marketing approach was the older cousin approach to marketing, where the idea is that you have a relative who introduces you to the game, tells you about it, and then you go on to play it. And like that was how they officially approached like the idea of D&D spreading, was that they relied on older generations to pass it on. And if all of the
Mm-hmm.
older players were moving on to another edition, that was what made them say, okay, well, we need to appeal to them, so let's just have them involved in the design process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really interesting. I don't. I think I stopped following D&D for a period of time. I ran a very big fourth edition campaign, um, and then kind of went off D&D for some number of years until actually, and I missed all of D&D next, and only came back into the game once fifth edition was out. So I missed a lot of that transition time and whatever kind of publicly the D&D team and Wizards of the Coast were saying or doing in terms of advertising or PR.
It's a point, actually. I don't think I've ever seen a D&D advert, though I am
Well,
curious what that
yeah.
would look like.
Well, way back in the day, they would be there. There were D&D adverts in like magazines and stuff.
Oh,
But
wow.
and there was a D&D cartoon, which is essentially an advertisement for the game.
Yeah, true.
But yeah, I mean, sooner or later we'll start seeing D&D advertisements in the form of D&D movies again. Um,
Mm.
I know, I believe that there's news out that there's a couple D&D movies in the works. Um, and that's all. I mean, that's part of, I think, also of, well, doesn't matter. There's this, the whole corporate strategy of like D&D being a brand, and I think to some extent 5e is that best of hits because there was an
Mm.
attempt to revitalize the brand so that it could be useful in selling video games, movies, all those things that are going to make them a lot more money than a tabletop game does.
Yeah, because I think like the largest point of that whole problem where they were losing players was that fifth edition ended up becoming that last hurrah, which is probably why it has that kind of feeling baked into it, because it was kind of the saving grace of the franchise. Like if fifth edition hadn't taken off, I'm pretty sure that might have been the last edition. Like,
Yeah, possible. Or they either would have, I mean, I doubt they would have sold it. They probably would have kept it until nostalgia rolled around and people were like, oh, I remember D&D and love D&D. And then they have researched it based on that. But yeah, I mean, I think it's one thing I think that complicates my relationship with D&D, and I think a lot of people's relationship with D&D is the extent to which it's compromised by corporate culture and exists as a corporate property and not as purely as somebody's creative or artistic effort.
do you feel like that seeps particularly deeply into fifth edition?
Well, it's one of those weird things where I think there's an extent to which some like there was a corporate directive to like get like write D&D 5th edition not to be innovative but to recollect all of these departed people. I mean, like the what happened in the creation of 5th edition is there was a financial goal and then the game design goals followed. It wasn't like, oh, I've got this great idea for the direction of a new edition of D&D. It was, we need to save this brand identity, brainstorm ways to do that, and then like the game design elements can come after all that. So I mean, there is, but in some ways that hasn't worked out too badly for them. You might have rethought things like the bioessentialist ideas of that are involved in the races in D&D. You might have rethought the inclusion of the monk class, some of the connotations of the barbarian class. There's a lot of things I think you might have wrestled with that because because the overarching goal of 5th edition was a financial one and not a creative or intellectual one. There was less of a need or desire to explore those potentially harmful topics because they know that fan base would give it a pass or mostly give it a pass. And they did for quite a few number of years. I mean, I think it's really only recently that, I mean, the bioessentialist race thing kind of feels like it came out of nowhere. I mean, it's been a problem for forever, and some people have known it was a problem for forever. But it does feel like all of a sudden it came into the public consciousness like really quickly, and then they're doing something about it in Tasha's, which is really good. Although I'm not sure I'm hearing really good things about the way they're choosing to do it, but yeah,
because it feels like a lot of the corporate interference, if you can use that term, like in D&D as a whole, has kind of been like central to major issues in every edition. Like in 3.5, it was making money, which is why you had tons of splat books.
right.
And I mean, they might have had some really great ideas in them. Like, I love the True Namer, but God help me, it is awfully made. Like,
Hmm.
I'm pretty sure
Yeah.
nothing in that book was ever tested or trialed or anything.
Hmm.
And then in fourth
Yeah.
edition, money is the reason that fourth edition was killed at the end of the day. Like,
Yeah.
it wasn't making enough. Even
But
it was a
yeah.
good idea, so get rid of it. Like,
And fourth edition had that supplement churn, the same supplement churn that third edition did too. I mean, it was just
ah,
it just pumped out player options. There were at least 3 players handbooks for that edition, at least 3 monster manuals for that edition, and then there was this, like 3 or 4 series of player options books, each one with 1 or 2 entries also. I mean, it was they were still churning books out at that point. I think there is an extent to which um there's a 5e is not just a reaction to some of the game design elements of previous versions of D&D, but it's also like, and actually now that I'm thinking about it, AD&D had this too, but it was more like they were churning out settings, which is ultimately what caused TSR to fail and have to sell D&D to Wizards of the Coast. Is that they broke up their own base into like fans of Ravenloft and fans of uh, Al Qadim and all these other settings that they had. So
like spread themselves too thin.
yeah, exactly. So I mean, they fifth edition kind of has taken the opposite tack of saying we're going to release 2-3 books a year instead of 2-3 books a season. And I do think that that's added to the longevity of the game, and that's a good thing. I am happy about that, even though I think the first few years after the game launched, I was feeling antsy for more player options the way I think a lot of people were.
Yeah, for sure. And I think probably another motivator for why we've had such a large spring in homebrew.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I think the perfect storm of it taking Wizards so long to put out another book of player options and the creation of the DMs Guild uh, really helped that take off.
And yeah, fifth edition, I mean, they've found like kind of a really good mix where obviously very wide appeal, easy to pick up and play. Like they've got Critical Role, which I think has been a massive saving grace for them. Like having this group of people who just, as hobbyists, wanted to bring it to more people and have
Mm-hmm.
become like spokespeople for the game in
Yeah.
effect.
Yeah.
And then that in turn has spread it out wider. They've like been doing the slower releases, as you say. So it's feels like it's been handled much more professionally than in the past. But then obviously the downside of it being so much having such a wide appeal is that it has ended up getting caught up in like around the time of the George Floyd murder. Obviously
Mm-hmm.
Black Lives Matter sprung up, became a huge thing again.
Mm-hmm.
And then I feel like because I mean I'm not going to get too much into politics, but it feels like D&D appeals to leftists, and a central thing with leftists, at least in like Twitter sphere, is that they will
Mm-hmm.
look for problematic things. Like they're very proactive in finding
Mm-hmm.
problems.
Right.
And obviously you add that to D&D, you end up with discovering and pulling into the limelight the problems that have been there and that were actually included intentionally because they're part of what makes D&D D&D. Like
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
having races, having monsters, having races as monsters, and having like the monk, which I'm sure people long ago were complaining about for different reasons.
Yeah. Um, I think to some extent that's all of those points are what make me excited about sixth edition, because I think that the D&D team will be a lot more thoughtful moving forward about what legacy elements of the game are worth leaving behind, um, because that cultural period where you could be that insensitive has passed.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, I'm excited to see a 6th edition that's informed by that, and to see, because I'm hoping that they can take that opportunity as a chance to, grow in a new direction and create new elements of a legacy. But I guess, we'll wait and see.
Yeah, and I think just in the discussions we've had today, as well as like all the other interviews I've done, like it occurs to me every time just how much room there is for improvement and what an amazing edition 6th edition could be with all these lessons learned. Taking out like the core problematic issues of like making race not a thing and maybe having like a system where culture and legacy is like central to who your character is, and getting rid of, say, like a monotonous variety of damaging spells, only a few of which you're ever actually going to use, and potentially including, say, like as you were saying earlier, like more utility magic that's going to add to the depth of the setting rather than necessarily just being practical and optimal for combat purposes.
Right. I mean, and if you had, I mean, I'm only addressing a small part of what you just said, but, and if you had like downtime activities, there's a ton of like things to write spells for just if you have downtime activities. Like running a business, there must be so many spells in a D&D world that just help you run a business, that do accounting for you, or that essentially give you a free laborer or something. Like Unseen Servant kind of does that. But there must be so many spells for all these areas of life that D&D doesn't focus on. It will be cool to see that. I don't see that as even necessarily being on the D&D team's radar. Like,
No.
I don't think that that's a part of, the things I mostly see D&D team getting feedback on are things like problematic representation of race, both in terms of races as they exist in the game, but also real world ethnicities and how they're portrayed in the game by way of the monk class. And I think I have heard good arguments that the barbarian is very similar, even though it's not referencing a specific culture as much.
Yeah, it has kind of like well, in England you could probably compare it to like the savage representation of like the Celtic races, like the Scots and the Irish from
Yeah,
time
well,
ago.
I mean, there's just this kind of tying together of like, it's a weird knot of different things. It's like, oh, it's this person who gets so mad they can't really control themselves, and they're super emotional in that respect, and they've got ties to animals and natures, like they're very primitive and natural. Like it's just there's starting to be a lot of uncomfortable. You start tying all those things together, it gets pretty uncomfortable.
By the way,
I
they
think,
can't read or write.
yeah, exactly right. Yeah, I mean, if you just called it a berserker and took out all of the like noble savage like junk that's in that class by default, and just had it be somebody who is empowered by their access to rage, like you could still incorporate elements of a tribal culture if you wanted to into some archetypes, and that would, I think, be much less problematic, because then you're not saying these two things are married together, but sometimes there's an overlap, and if you want that overlap, then here. But when you kind of make those two things that part of the same identity, that becomes like a really huge problem, I think.
Yeah, and I think like, I mean, you could still have like the ornamental kind of elements of D&D that aren't really problematic, but I mean, like, say if you are gonna simplify magic, you only need like a few damaging spells. I mean, you can keep like the fireball and the magic missile, and
Right.
they could be broken because you don't really need them to not be. But you could include the things that are still legacy to D&D that aren't necessarily incorporated into it, like the idea of making your own spells, like all those famous wizards from Greyhawk saying that. I mean, Mordenkainen, he's got his own book. Like Tash has got her own book. when are we gonna make it so that players are empowered to create their own spells using mechanics in the game for that?
Yep. Yeah.
To like go off and create their own like circle of 9.
Yeah, I really hope. I mean, that and to me that also feels like, as much as I'd like to see that earlier in the life cycle of 5th edition, that also kind of feels like a perfect way to send it off. Say like, hey, you know what? Play this game forever with the stuff that you write, and here's a whole book on game design and how to homebrew for 5th edition. That's kind of that would feel like I don't know. I'm feeling sentimental about it for some reason, but that seems like it would be a really sweet send off.
So like a Gygax's Guide to Infinity.
There you go. Oh my God, you got the title and everything. Yeah, no, that's a great name for it. Yeah, I mean, it's a really great idea.
That's a really good idea, man.
Yeah, we got to pitch that to Wizards of the Coast.
Get Mills on the phone right now.
Yeah, well, if Merle, we might want to sidestep Merle, so it's a whole nother can of worms. So.
Oh yeah, I forgot about that. Chris Perkins, can we go with him?
There we go. Yeah, we can talk to Chris Perkins about it.
Jeez.
Yeah.
Well, we can at least hope that the staff for 6th edition are a little less problematic as well.
Yeah, very much so. Yeah, I mean, I don't know how they included some of the stinkers they did on the 5th edition. It's not even as much the core team as much as some of the consultants they had in. It seems like there was like no vetting of the consultants whatsoever, but several of them, were already kind of out as being pretty awful humans before they got the job, but then certainly since then have made efforts to hide their behaviors or ideologies that are
it's
pretty
almost
unbecoming.
Like the Me Too wave kind of spread so deep and wide that it's only just at this point hit this particular industry.
Yeah, I mean, maybe it just speaks to how long 5th edition has been around. It's been around through a few different social movements now that have caused, fans of the games to reflect on how those social movements are represented in the game and in the industry. And it's, and it has not in no case has it reflected well on D&D or the D&D team.
Yeah, and I mean, adding into the fact that Zoomers are also like super political, like
yeah. But I think that's like I said, that's what'll be exciting about 6th edition is to see, there's like D&D is the most popular it's ever been, and a lot of that is fueled by young people, and so if you want to, keep those young people in your game and not leaving for something that's a more progressive alternative, they're going to have to start addressing these old problematic legacy pieces. And I think it's going to be awesome when they do that. Because there's a lot more interesting ways of handling like character identity than the way race is currently done, for example.
Yeah, 100%.
And actually, on DM's Guild and on Drive Thru RPG, I know there are several people who've written alternatives that are very popular. So it's already something other people are exploring and experimenting with. So it'll be cool to see how the team does it when they have the opportunity to.
Yeah, totally. I think like it's one of those things where I almost want to temper my expectations because it feels like there are so many elements to D&D that, I mean, I would love to have included and removed, and obviously we've talked about some of it here, but I guarantee that like I don't know how the community at large will feel about that.
Yeah.
Like you're going to have the people who will jump ship the moment they find out that you can't be a particular race, like because it's just not called race anymore.
Right.
Or if you took out Fireball, like how many people would you piss off doing that?
That would be interesting to find out what would piss off the most number of people if you took it out of the game, like what element of D&D. I mean, it's for sure, I think, going to upset people when and if and how these things get addressed. because you already have, I mean, because we're just in a time of huge cultural conflict anyway, and that is bound to happen. But then also you see it raging every day on Twitter and Reddit and everywhere else. Conversations are being had online between progressives and I'm not sure what even the right word for the
Traditionalists?
traditionalists. I have a habit of calling them regressives, but I think that's
Well,
probably traditionalists. Traditionalist is a less incendiary.
that's a
Is
good
a
way of
less
putting it.
incendiary word. Yeah.
I mean, the whole point of conservatism is to conserve and the traditions and the way things are and the status quo. And
Right.
I don't know if that's it feels incendiary from a leftist perspective, but I feel like it's accurate as well as a
Well,
description.
no, I was saying your description is less incendiary. My description of regressive is quite incendiary, which most of the time I don't mind, but for the purposes of this conversation, I definitely think we should be saying traditionalist.
That's totally fair. And yeah, I think even Matthew Colville lately he did that video on making D&D more disco.
Uh-huh.
Using like the analogy of disco music, which was progressive in comparison to the traditionalism of like the Beatles and
Mhm.
their kind of music at the time. Like disco was
Mhm.
to break out of that and try and do something completely different. And everyone said it was going to fail, but it like took off and became this big thing. And it was all like embraced by like the left and gays, and like it brought so much color and flavor to culture at the time.
Mhm.
And he wants to push that idea for D&D in including homebrew and creating like games and mechanics which appeal to inclusivity and more expressive, dynamic approaches to things.
Yeah, that's I haven't seen that video, but that's an interesting um context for that cultural moment that I never would have thought of disco as being particularly having a particular cultural or political momentum behind it. But that, yeah, I mean, it does sound self-evident upon hearing it.
Like I had no idea until I saw the video either.
Yeah, and that is an interesting idea of how you would do that for D&D. And I think what's weird is that um, the a lot of people who play D&D are D&D is a huge tent already. So it is kind of I mean, there is a lot of clinging to the past in terms of the identity. I mean, I know that it's a priority for the team and that they're always trying to improve the representation in the game. But D&D is a huge tent, and there's all kinds of people playing it from all kinds of backgrounds and with all kinds of orientations and identities and all that. And I don't know, somehow the metaphor of disco does make me think, yeah, like, can we not just fully put all these people front and center in the
Mm.
game so that like it's just it doesn't have to be something where like, oh, guess what, now that we're on the 20th book in the series, we've included a transgender person for the first time. Like, all right, thanks for throwing us a bone, I guess.
Like, have you played Dragon Heist?
I have not, huh?
So I mean, that kind of felt like going a little too far. Like, I mean, it was nice to like so in chapter 2 that you get a little bit of spoiler.
Mhm.
You get basically given a tavern to run,
Uh-huh.
and you join like a little alleyway community. But
Hmm.
all of the characters are like super pandering, like to the left. You like
Hmm.
you immediately run into like the lesbian couple and the gay couple and like the non-gender the person whose gender identity is they
Hmm.
them, and they're non-binary, and like it's just so much thrown at you at once.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
I think the one cis guy in there is like trying to shut you down.
Yeah, I wonder if they were going for some kind of like Stonewall reference maybe or something with that. Not sure that would be an intelligent reference to be making, but
Maybe.
just but when I think of like a tavern with a really queer culture and then a cis opposition to it, that's where my mind would immediately go. But yeah, I mean, and I think that speaks to the challenging position that the D&D team is in of, they've got to stake their own moral and ethical position in all of this and say who they're not afraid to offend and who they don't want to offend, and who they think is right. And that's a really tricky situation because no matter what they do, there will be people on either side of the cultural spectrum saying that it was too much or not enough. And but on the other hand, there are really real ways in which I think they've failed to keep the game up with the cultural moment, and definitely failed to be ahead of the cultural moment, which might be important in a in a game like D&D where it's supposed to last for like a decade. I mean, you're gonna have to hire a mind reader or not a mind reader, but a fortune teller so that they can know what's going to happen 5 years ahead of time and write to that audience.
Yeah, well, I mean, they just need to hire like more diverse people.
Well, yes, certainly that. Yeah.
And I think like another thing that we have to bear in mind, obviously, is that, I mean, you do have conservative D&D players, and they might be inclined to play D&D in conservative ways. Like, there's absolutely going to be a faction of people out there who want like their races. They want like evil drow, evil orcs. Like this is classical fantasy. This is Lord of the Rings. It wasn't controversial back then. Like
yeah. Well, that's what I mean. Where they've got to decide what's the ethical and moral position they're going to take. Who are they not afraid of upsetting? Like I personally don't mind maybe upsetting somebody who has biessentialist ideas and thinks that a whole race of people can be evil. Maybe that's not a ideology I mind putting off. But they're in a different circumstance too, where they've got financial masters to please too, and so I have the luxury of when I choose to write, I can write based on what I think is right and good, and satisfying to me. But when you're on that team, you have to meet goals beyond your own, following your own compass.
Yeah, and I think that's another point where that corporate interference can play in again, where, I mean, if it is going to reduce Hasbro's stocks by not pandering to everyone, like if you just pander to the left, then they're not going to do it. Like, and I mean, there's obviously a very diverse world out there of people. I mean, from people who are like playing Root and like what's his name, Kazumi Chin, like he's a really interesting like figure on Twitter that's got some really interesting progressive ideas on TTRPGs, to people who like playing Fatal.
Yeah, we can definitely exclude those people.
And yeah, a word of warning to the audience, like if you're going to look into Fatal, it's a bit not safe for life. Like imagine all the absolute worst things you could think of, like for like all the horror stories from TTRPGs, and that stuff is baked into the game. So
yeah, I haven't even thought about Fatal for probably a decade. So thanks for bringing that back into my consciousness.
Well, I'm sorry.
That's all right. I don't think it'll take long for it to leave again, but yeah, I remember all the less said about Fatal, the better.
Yeah, but I mean, the whole point is that you do have people out there who want that kind of experience, and
yeah,
I mean, it's whether or not Wizards of the Coast are interested, not necessarily placating to that level of experience, but
yeah,
incorporating or including those people with or people that lean in that direction towards the mass market.
Yeah. I mean, this is a bit tangential, but it's a similar spot to what comics and like Marvel is in terms of like the stories they choose to tell are fairly left leaning,
Hmm.
and they've been criticized from the right about some of the stories they choose to tell, who they make the villains and who they make the heroes and things like that.
Yeah, especially these days.
But then, there have been attempts on the right to build comic companies and comic books to a right audience, and they like miserably fail constantly all the time,
Hmm.
which makes me just wonder how much that's really a market worth going after. But now we're getting into a something I feel woefully unprepared to really have much to say on.
No, I can appreciate that feeling. Like I could maybe talk about the Punisher. Like he's a bit right.
Oh God, yeah. Um,
It's kind of a power fantasy thing.
and the weird way in that which that character has been in the states, at least, the weird way um, that character has been co-opted. I mean, like, he murders police officers,
mm.
and police officers love him. Like, I think it's because they just see a big muscle dude with two AK-47s or something shooting indiscriminately into a crowd, and they're like, yeah, that's our guy, which is super worrying in its own right. But
He's like the walking Second Amendment, right?
yes, except well, and also like the biggest advertisement about why you should not have a Second Amendment. But
Mm. Well, he gets rid of like
yeah,
the due process and everything.
yeah, he gets rid of due process, and he and often in his misadventures, he like he if cops aren't good, he kills them too, and he has
Mm.
many times. A lot of his stories are about how criminal influence extends into the like legal structure, and so he roots it out wherever he finds it. He doesn't just stick to a particular.
I guess you could say he drains the swamp.
To use a very incendiary phrase, yes, he drains the swamp.
Mm. But
Yeah,
yeah, like I mean, you're free to run that kind of D&D game if you want to, and your friends enjoy that kind of thing. I don't know that it should necessarily be first party though.
yeah. I think it's worth not supporting those kinds of games. Like if people have to do that and really want to do that, go off and do it, I guess. But that's something where I think the power that the D&D team has is to outline the scope of good stories and what good storytelling is and what is good and right, like what heroes do and what villains do.
Hmm.
And since they have all that power, you know, and I think it behooves them to wield it responsibly. And if people want to tell stories that are out of alignment with those values, then maybe that's that person's choice. But I don't think we should be helping them do that by including things like elves are fair skinned except for the drow who are all bad and they're dark. Uh,
Yeah.
like we shouldn't be making this easy for people to tell their like kind of bigoted racist fantasy stories. Like they should have to put some amount of effort in.
Yeah. I think largely Wizards will at least aim to be neutral. Like, I don't think fantasy necessarily has to cater to left or right, like real world political outlooks. Like, the hero's journey very much transcends politics, I feel, which is why you can apply it so widely in,
Right.
like, in cinema. Like, and as we move more into a more heavily narrative style of game,
Hmm.
I feel like maybe that will become more central to D&D as we move forward.
Yeah. But like you said, I think the cure for all of this is for them to do a really good job hiring diverse talent for their next for their books generally, but then also certainly for gear if they were ever to begin gearing up for a sixth edition,
Hmm.
making sure that at the very least they're not hiring um, known misogynists and racists to be their consultants.
Yeah. And I think, yeah, there is like obviously the problem within D&D stuff. And my understanding around Wizards of the Coast internally is it kind of falls into the same problems as old like video game studios, where you've had like the original generation of designers have like tutored the people under them who rise up, and they're all kind of waiting for their turn at the top.
Right.
And it becomes that old boys club kind of feel.
Yeah.
Where like as the more sensible older generation might move out, you then end up with people who have put their time in and might be like do their turn at the top rather than necessarily being the right person for it.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. I mean, and this is also tangential, but I mean, there's research that shows that white Americans don't do a great job of social networking outside of their ethnic group as well, which also then creates a kind of feedback loop of exactly that nature, where like if I'm primarily using my social network or my contact network to fill positions in D&D, and there's good scientific evidence that that's compromised by some implicit bias, and the D&D team is going to keep looking pretty much the same regardless of how much I make an effort to diversify it.
I mean, I'll admit that I run into similar problems. Like, I mean, even within the show itself, like, I mean, I'd say a vast majority of the people I've interviewed are like white straight males, as far as I'm aware. Like,
Right.
I think maybe Kime was the only like non-white guy that I've interviewed so far. And I mean,
Yeah.
I'd love to interview a more diverse group of people. But like, I don't know that many that exist within the community.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a bit of a one thing that I struggle with, because I have assembled projects before, is how do you specifically do outreach to people outside of your identity, without it feeling like, oh, I'm hiring you or I'm contacting you because of your identity. Like that feels like maybe it would be,
Yeah, like you don't want to be pandering.
yeah, like to that person specifically. Like I don't want you to feel like that's the only reason I want to talk to you or include you in this project or whatever else. So I don't know. I mean, that's a white guilt thing for me to figure out.
Yeah, because I mean, I certainly know like there's plenty of female homebrewers, like non-binary brewers.
Yep.
I mean, you see them in like the Discord of many things.
Uh-huh.
Number one spot for brewers, like from Reddit. It's hugely diverse, like in terms of the people there. But of the people that I tend to interview, I mainly go through like recommendations, and people will say like, oh, well, this person's achieved this kind of accolade and worked on this really big project or specializes in this particular brew, which make for interesting like topics to talk about, and subjects to interview. Obviously, you're well known as like the king of, it's not D&D Beyond, it's GM's Guild.
Wow, is that really my reputation? I was like hanging on your next words there because I was like, king of what? I'm known as the king of something?
Well, I think you're probably the most reputable and like known for being the most successful person on DM's Guild.
Wow, I did not realize I had that reputation. That's I'm honestly blushing right now.
But yeah, I'd say like of all the brewers on DM's Guild, like if I ask someone like, oh, if you could name a brewer from there, they're probably gonna say like Sterling Vermin, Benjamin Huffman. Like everyone knows the Pugilist. Like,
well, yeah, that's true.
or people will have run into like the Magus or one of the races like the Dhampir or Pact-born Beastfolk. Like hell, like 3 of my players were co-players are running Beastfolk characters.
Oh, yeah, that one is surprisingly popular. And every once in a while I go look at it and I'm like, the furry audience is so huge that like it's really untapped. Like I should write more animal people, because I think that there's a huge appetite for that. And I don't necessarily, I mean, I'm not sure, I don't necessarily mean furry in the kind of context in which, certainly not as a derogatory term, but also not even necessarily somebody who identifies as a furry, but just who enjoys anthropomorphized animals.
Yeah, because I mean, it overlaps with like the classic sort of Disney cartoon audience where you had like all the anthropomorphized characters.
Yeah.
It also falls into like that same kind of feel as like Humblewood and Root, Wonder Song. Is that the right one?
There's also just so much character built into it. Like if I'm playing an owl person, we already can pretty much guess that I'm playing somebody who's wise or scholarly, and maybe a bit dangerous, probably stays up late. There's a lot of like, because of the cultural connections or connotations or sometimes physical realities of these animals, there's like a lot of, it characterizes the character you're creating so much for you without you having to do anything else. Like it's kind of the easiest way to remove fantasy races from a game is to put in animal people races, because there's so many connotations based on the kind of animal you choose, and you can kind of envision so much just based on the animal.
Well, it just occurred to me that like you almost have the same situation where you can make like generalizations and stereotypes without it hurting anyone.
Right. I mean, that's the other, I think, huge, I mean, good thing about it is that those stereotypes about animals aren't harmful to anyone. So
it's a very safe space.
Yeah, right.
And it takes on like a whole different. Sorry.
And there's no question about like representing a particular ethnicity or whatever, because it's just like it's a dog person. Like it's the colors that dogs normally are. I mean, I guess you could, if you really wanted to be offensive with it, you could start putting accents on different animals or whatever. But
like the way you anthropomorphize them could include what is the term? Like, is it typing or like like when they put like a dreadlock style hair on a character?
Oh, okay. Yeah, I'm not sure exactly what that is called, but yes, I know what you're talking about.
Yeah. Like you can do that.
Yeah. But you shouldn't.
Yeah, and the basic concept doesn't invite you to necessarily.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think another really good thing about the Beastfolk race, certainly that makes it enticing to the people that I play with, is the modularity of it, because it is like this very simple core concept that is super customizable for the sub race.
Yeah. That's actually something I experimented again with recently with a race I wrote called the Kilnkin, Kilnkin. And that's a race where you get 2 sub races, and there's two categories of sub races, and you get 1 from each of them. And so there's a big mix and match, like, oh, I'm going to be a 1B Kilnkin or a 2A Kilnkin or whatever else. Like it's one race, but there's I mean, let me do the math real quick. 6, I guess, different variations that you could be within that, because 9 variations that you can be within that, based on the 2 sub races you pick. So yeah, just to say that I've experimented with that again recently, and I think there's a lot of fun space there to make races less like monolithic.
Yeah, 100%. And yeah, it reminds me of Izzy. I don't know if you've ever heard of him. He's like another brewer from the Discord of many things. But he has this concept for a class which has 2 subclasses that you kind of merge. It's almost like how the Warlock has like the Pact and the Oath. Or the Patron, sorry.
Yeah, Pact and Patron.
Yeah, and one informs like the theme and the other informs the mechanics in a way. So you end up with 2 axes on which your character can be vastly different regardless of which 2 choices you make.
Yeah, that's really cool.
Yeah, seeing that really applied in the context of races is definitely an interesting take.
Yeah, I mean, I think probably ultimately that would be a good route for them to take in reimagining these things too, is to have like a heritage that's more about kind of your people that you come down from, and then a culture where that's more about sort of like, well, your culture. uh, yeah, like I think, and in which case, then that component of your identity, which right now is all wrapped up in race, becomes two things. And it's already like kind of weird in this, like even if you took out all the problematic elements from it, it's weird when like, well, I want to play a dwarf, but like he was abandoned, or maybe his parents got killed and now he lives with humans or whatever. Do I still get stone cunning? Do I still get all these other things? Well, yeah, because that's part of the dwarf racial traits, but it's weird and doesn't make sense anymore when you try to create a character that doesn't have the same cultural background. Not to mention the problem of just it's weird to have monolithic cultural blocks in all non-human races.
Yeah, and I think it actually does fit into the kind of like there has always been like a meta kind of context to D&D where from edition to edition the world and the gods, even if they're not like a specific settings version of them, they do evolve as time goes on. Like the idea that you had like 9th level magic, 10th level magic once upon a time, and that's baked into the history of D&D. So it kind of makes sense that in 6th edition, the world might be going through this cultural revolution. And that's literally represented through the way that the game is built. In the same way that they've changed how magic works and changed how like particular gods function and like the mechanics of the universe and how planes interact.
Yeah, I mean, I think no in-setting justification would necessarily be needed, but there might be really interesting storytelling opportunities to when you do it to justify how that's changing in the world. I had not thought about that, but it's an interesting idea.
But yeah, man, I really appreciate you making the time. It's been a really interesting conversation.
Thank you. Yeah, it was an interesting conversation, and it is going to make my whole weekend that in some corner of the internet I'm known as the king of DMs Guild. I'm going to start seeding that out there, see if I can get that to spread.
Hey, go for it, man. Like, I certainly represent you. So, or is it they call it stanning these days?
Yeah, there we go. Yeah.
Oh, geez. But yeah, man, I hope we can talk again at some point in the future.
That sounds great.
Yeah, it was fantastic. Thank you very much again. Have a lovely evening, dude.
You too. Bye-bye.
Thanks again to Benjamin for joining us. If you like the sound of his work and want to check it out, there are links in the description. And join us next time when we'll be talking to Jorving, a widely beloved friend of the Discord and Many Things community, who's well known for his imaginative world building, best showcased in his campaign setting of Ivara. Of course, last but not least, thank you for making it to the end of the video. And until the next adventure, stay safe.